Hi, welcome back. It's Chava, life coach and practitioner of Chinese medicine. I am here answering your questions. Today is going to be a little different than my previous videos. First of all, because I have a new application I'm playing with, so hopefully you'll be able to see both me talking, excuse me, and the words on the screen. I have a little bit of a cold that I'm getting over, so I'm a little sniffly. Um, and today I'm going to be talking not specifically from the perspective of Chinese medicine, but more taking a reasonably complex topic in from the world of uh, the most modern and up to date research on treating or preventing post traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) and trying to explain it in simple and easily comprehensible language, why this works and how to do it. Um, I posted a video last month about emotions and Chinese medicine, and I made a brief mention of there being specific ways to treat people who have suffered a traumatic shock, an emotional shock, not people who are necessarily going into physical shock due to loss of blood, God forbid, or something like that. And I was asked to expand about that a little, what the different types of response are to emotional trauma and how to interact with them. So I want to say that I am absolutely not an expert in this, but it is one of the areas that I find very interesting to learn about, and also something that I think everyone needs to know more about. So I have in the past taken seminars on treating or preventing PTSD. I've helped to arrange seminars for acupuncturists on the subject. I was part of a nonprofit organization that specialized in treating people with PTSD using acupuncture and Chinese medicine. And I really think that this is one of the areas that it will improve all of our lives more if we know more about and we know how to treat, and even more importantly, how to prevent. Because PTSD is something that can happen to any of us if we suffer a severe enough shock or trauma, and it can have a huge impact on quality of life, on the ability to function, on the ability to do anything, and of course on the family and everyone who has to interact with the person who is suffering from the disorder. And I think that looking at the extreme end of one type of reaction can help us learn about ways to deal with the less extreme manifestations along that same spectrum. So I think I've heard a lot of people say that after the last 2 years of COVID, we all have some sort of PTSD. And while that is not diagnostically correct, yes, we all have experienced extreme stress. We've all experienced we've all experienced things that are outside of our normal ability, or of our normal experience, and outside of things that we have a learned ability to deal with and process. And so studying how people react to states of extreme stress and how to prevent them from developing long-term issues as a result of extreme stress can only be beneficial to all of us at this point. So today, again, I want to make it clear that I am not an expert. I have studied with experts, I've learned from experts, and I have attempted to, a number of times, explain the research and explain the thinking behind it to people, and I've come up with what I think is a sort of a simplification that is easily grasped and doesn't lose any of the essential pieces of information the actual research. I will include notes where you can read longer scientific papers with footnotes if that's something you're interested in. And I'm just going to jump into trying to explain a little bit about PTSD and how it works and how we can treat it, how we can prevent it developing in people who've experienced extreme shock and emotional trauma. And again, please remember, this is a simplification. I think that it is a useful simplification and a workable one, but this is obviously not the way actual people with PhDs would explain it. All right, so here we go. The model that we'll be discussing for treating people who have experienced trauma is called the Sixties Model in English. In Hebrew, it's called Maaseh, which is it's an acronym, and it means an act, an action, because what we're going to be doing, or what we want to do with people who've experienced emotional shock, is as quickly as possible to get them up and acting and taking action to take care of themselves, to help themselves, to let them see that they are not helpless in the face of whatever happened to them. And this is kind of based on research that goes back to, I think, the First World War, but definitely Korean and Vietnam. The American Army and possibly other, and I believe the British Army also did research on this. I don't know of any others, but I'm sure there were, saw that soldiers who were experiencing shell shock, battle fatigue, whatever they called it, whatever point in time, if they were immediately withdrawn from the fighting and sent home, tended to have a much more difficult time recovering than if they were actually sent back out into the field, into conditions where they were put under the same stress that they had been before, but given the tools to act against it. Now, this is kind of a difficult balance, because they also found out, certainly in World War II and in World War I, I think was when the research started, that human beings who are exposed to too much stress of specific sorts for too long a period of time will become unable to function, and you can't send them back to the front. And I think they did research and concluded that if I think the numbers they came up with were, if 100 men are shelled for 100 days, by the end of that time, 95 of them will be shell shocked, will be unable to function normally. There's just a certain level of built up stress and trauma that the human mind is not able to process. And so one of the things that people in the military have worked on, in order to, because this is kind of the area where people put the most thought and effort and money into researching how to keep people functioning and how to treat people who have experienced very severe trauma, is that you have to, on the one hand, not overexpose people, but on the other hand, you can't just, once they reach the breaking point, you can't just send them back home and let them pick things up on their own. They do need to be taken to a place where they can act against this similar shock to what they were feeling, or similar trauma to what they were feeling, similar trauma to what they experienced, if possible. So we discussed why it's important to learn about this subject. First of all, because it's something that is important to all of us to know. Also, because this model, it really is first aid. It's something that you have to do immediately, as soon as possible, with people who have experienced emotional trauma, in order to prevent the long-term effects of PTSD. Which is why in Israel it's now being taught, or it's supposed to be being taught, to all first responders. so that just like people will know how to do CPR or how to put on a tourniquet, they will know how to intervene appropriately in order to help people who have experienced emotional shock. Now, on the same order, just like if you haven't been trained in how to do CPR or how to put on a tourniquet, you should not try and do these things because the odds are very high that you're going to make the situation worse. And so I am not advising you, after watching a video with me, to go out there and necessarily try and intervene if you come across a situation where someone is experiencing emotional trauma. I want you to be aware of what the options are, maybe so you can go on and be trained, or so that you can see how these interventions can be used in less severe circumstances. And I want you to know how you can help in situations where people are experiencing emotional trauma, because being able to effectively help other people and yourself is the best way to make sure that you don't develop long-term symptoms of trauma. Okay, so like I said, we were talking about an early stage intervention. It's something you do with people who are still freaking out, who are still shaking, who are still non-communicative after some sort of trauma, like witnessing a car accident or being in a car accident, or hearing an air raid siren, or escaping from a collapsing building. People who are still shaking or who are not totally with you. This is the stage where the intervention can be helpful. So like I said, the Sixties model that we're discussing was developed in Israel. It was implemented first in the IDF based on long-term studies of exactly what interventions helped soldiers who had experienced emotional trauma stay or regain function as much as possible and not suffer long-term side effects of PTSD. It became the national model in Israel a few years ago. All first responders are supposed to be trained in it. I don't think that it has been officially taken on as the recommended proceedings outside of Israel yet, but certainly a number of other countries are looking into it. So we're going to talk about what happens in trauma, what happens to brains, and why we need to intervene. Okay, so our brains are made up of lots of different parts, right? We have two halves, which are kind of similar, but they're not exactly the same. Or we can look at it as the layers. We have the inner layer, the oldest part of the brain, and we have the middle layer, and we have the outer layer, the cortex, which is what makes us human, what sets us apart from most of the other animals. We can look at the terms of function. There's a motor area, there's a sensory area. They're not on these sides. I don't know why I was doing that. There's a verbal area that is generally on the left. There's all sorts of ways that we can look at the brain. And one of the models that I found very helpful in explaining brain function to people in general, and certainly to younger people, is looking at a kind of evolutionary perspective on the brain. So I talk about the lizard brain, the monkey brain, and the thinking brain. Where the lizard brain is the older parts of the brain. It's what we have in common with all of the animals around us. When I talk about the monkey brain, I talk about the part of the brain that deals more with emotions and with relationships, interacting with other people, understanding, whether someone's mad at me, and if so, is it fair that they're mad at me? All of this kind of subconscious work that we do all the time in order to stay connected to other people and to understand kind of where we stand in our pack. And then we have the thinking brain, the cognitive brain. That's the part that can do math and read and what most people think of, I think, when they say brain. This isn't an exact description of what exactly goes on, but it's close enough to be useful. And so when we're going through life, we need to be able to switch back and forth between which brain is taking control at any given point in time, right? So if I am, I'm driving down the street and all of a sudden a car runs a red and cuts in front of me, I need the lizard brain to take over and to hit the brakes, because the lizard brain moves the fastest. It doesn't stop to think, what should I do now? The lizard brain is about the immediate reaction. It's the fight or flight instinct. It's the part that jerks your arm back if you touch something that's too hot, or that helps you find your balance when you're walking down the stairs and your foot slips, right? We're talking about immediate instinctive reactions, and we need those to survive. We also need the emotional part of our brain. We need the part of our brain that can pick up on things like, I can't think of a better example. When someone says, "Do I look fat in this dress?" Right? The thinking part of the brain should not be answering. The emotional part of the brain should step in. It should pick up on body language, and it should pick up on verbal cues, and it should understand that this is not a question to be answered with an accurate and truthful answer, but rather this is a question that's trying to explore how the relationship between us stands and how it's going to develop. Or, if you're playing with your grandchild, then ideally you will not also be calculating, how much money do I have left in the bank? And if I pay this, will I be able to cover that? And you should be able to be present and just experience the emotion of being with your grandchild. And we definitely need our thinking brain. I need my thinking brain to write out the notes for this video. We need it to do math. We need it generally in work. We need it because we do need to be able to keep track of how much money we have left in our bank account if we have to transfer from savings in order to cover this big expense. And so in a healthy person, we can use each of these aspects of our brain when we need to. And one of the things that needs to be done when we're in a situation that is developing very quickly, or that involves immediate threat to our physical health, to our survival, is the lizard is supposed to take over, and the lizard is supposed to run the show. And that is for a couple of reasons. One is that sometimes we need to react faster than we can think. Thinking does actually take time. Another reason is that our brain consumes a huge amount of nutrients, oxygen, sugar, all these things that other parts of our body can also use, things like our muscles, go to the brain in order to keep all of that processing going. Our brain has a lot of processing power. It makes a lot of demands on the body. And so in the average human being, a brain is 2% of the body weight, and it gets 20% of our blood flow. Every time our heart pumps, 20% of the blood in our body gets sent up to our brain. All right, so if we are in a situation where our physical survival is threatened, we're probably going to need to run or to fight, which requires using our muscles very intensely, more than we're going to need to think. Or at least that was true until very, very recently, evolutionarily. So in a traumatic situation, the thinking brain turns off, the emotional processing part of the brain turns off, and we are left with pure reaction. It's the part of the brain that we share with lizards and with toads and with cats and with every animal out there. Takes over, and it's just concerned about getting our body out of whatever is going on in one piece. And what this means, and this is one of my hobby horses. This is something I think it's so important for people to know. What this means is that it is not fair, it's not appropriate, it isn't right to blame a person for how they reacted during a time of emotion, during a period, during a situation where they were emotionally traumatized. Saying, you should have run the other way, you should have gone back for this thing, you should have stopped to lock the door. The thinking part of the brain was not working. And someone experiencing emotional trauma, they can't think. Thinking gets turned off, and you are left with instincts. You are left with literally the instinctive drives of run, fight, freeze, or with things that you have been trained to do and that you have practiced over and over and over and over again to the point where they become muscle memory. Or if you have been trained in specific traumatic situations to actively turn off the lizard brain and turn the thinking brain back on. And this is something that has to be done with first responders and with soldiers, with airline pilots. Airline pilots have to be trained that when there is an immediate state of threat to their survival, that they don't freeze or they don't run out of the cockpit. They have to be trained to do a very specific set of steps. You go to the binder with the emergency checklist, you find the right checklist, you act according to it. This involves a lot of training. And there's a reason that the checklists are there. It's because even if you can kind of get the brain back to working, you can't be stopping to think and process and go, okay, once I've checked and made sure that the fire is out, what is the next step? You have to have the things laid out 1, 2, 3, because you are not going to be thinking at your highest level. That's just not how our bodies are designed. And so this is very, very important for a couple of reasons. First of all, just to know, it's not fair and it's not right to expect more of people than they were trained to do or than they're physically capable of doing. But also because one of the things, it's not part of the immediate response to PTSD or to acute trauma, but one of the things that has a very, very strong effect on whether someone who has gone through a traumatizing situation will develop long-term PTSD or will be able to recover relatively quickly and function normally in the world is how what they went through and how they reacted is seen by the world around them. If someone is being blamed for not doing the right thing, for being a coward, for whatever, someone who is being blamed and doesn't even, it's not even someone who's being blamed for behaving wrongly, who is behaving in a way that society does not expect of them, or someone who feels that they themselves should have done something different but that they weren't able to, is much more likely to develop long-term symptoms and loss of ability to function, loss of quality of life. And so this is just really important to remember. I remember a situation where there was a shooting in a synagogue, and afterwards I was talking with a neighbor of mine who was saying, oh, well, the people present should have done X, Y, Z. They should have behaved differently. And I was like, have you ever been shot at? Have you ever been in a traumatic enough situation that your brain turned off? No. So you can't say things like that. These are not people who are trained in how to respond when someone is trying to kill them. And so the reactions they had were just the natural animal reactions that we all have built into us. And you can't blame them for acting one way rather than another, for running rather than fighting, or for hiding rather than you. It's not a decision which is made at the level of cognition. It's not a decision you say it's made on the level of the soul. This is a decision that comes from the animal spirit. And so it's not, the person didn't have a choice necessarily in that moment in how they responded. So kudos to my neighbor. After we talked about it for a couple weeks in intermittent conversations, he concluded that he needed to rethink his position and to look more carefully at times when he had experienced extreme stress and had not reacted the way he theoretically would have wanted to before he started passing judgment on other people. So really respect him for that, because that can be a hard position to get to. Okay, so we have experienced some sort of traumatic event. We've been in a car accident, say. So the thinking and the emotive parts of the brain are turned off. We just have the lizard who's there going, is anyone bleeding? Do we need to run away? Is the car going to blow up? Is there a fire? Do I smell gas? Do I need to call for help? This is what we're left with, right? We don't have complicated thinking. We should not be processing the event emotionally, right? This is not the time to start the emotional processing. We should not be doing that until we know that we are physically safe, and so is everyone else. So ideally, what you want to do is you want to go from the lizard brain controlling everything to the thinking brain taking charge and calling 911 or whatever the local emergency line is, checking to see if there's anyone in the car, seeing if anyone needs first aid. We want the thinking brain to come back online, and then only later, once we are completely safe, we want to start doing the emotional processing. But sometimes what happens is that instead of the thinking brain coming back first, the thinking brain is still being shut down by the lizard. The lizard is not letting the thinking brain take over because it feels like we don't have enough energy to do that. We don't have enough spare cognitive power or whatever. And the monkey brain kind of gets out and takes a look around before the situation is ready for it or before it's ready to deal with the situation. And it triggers this emotional overload because this is not a situation where we should be processing the emotions. The emotions are too strong. There's still too much going on. We're too vulnerable. And yet we start trying to process the emotions and we end up in this kind of we're just stuck. We're in this kind of feedback loop of everything is too much and we feel like we have to process it. And we can't even think about it because it's too much. So we can't take any action to make it better. And this is that kind of extreme shock where people freeze up or they become manic. They're just running around and yelling because they're stuck with the part of the brain that doesn't need to be working right now has taken over. And so what we need to do with people in this situation is we need to get them thinking and acting as quickly as possible. And the reason we need to do that is that the things that cause a person to develop long-term psychological problems, to develop PTSD, to develop long-term trauma, to lose the ability to function, are feeling that they've lost control, that they're helpless, that they're isolated, that no one else is with them, that no one understands them, confusion about what happened. All of these are the things that if a person is experiencing them, and for the longer time that a person is experiencing them, the more likely it is that they'll develop PTSD. So we want to get people to come to leave that place of being emotionally overwhelmed and feeling like they have no control and feeling like they can't do anything as quickly as possible. And so what we have to do is we have to take them out of the emotional thinking, the emotional brain, and get them into the thinking brain and get them to take action that that they can see as being effective against the situation, against the traumatic event. They have to be able to take action to help themselves in order to prevent the feeling of helplessness. They need to be able to process intellectually what happened in order to deal with the confusion and overwhelm. Okay, so I'm going to go through the steps at this point one by one. Okay, so when you have a person who is either shaking, comatose, not responsive, or someone who is yelling and screaming and not really there and present with you, the first thing that we want to do is we want to overcome the feeling of isolation. And so we have to make a connection with that person and we have to convey to them that we are there with them. And you can do this. You use the person's name. You talk to them as much as possible. You just stay there with them. If they're not acting in a way where it seems dangerous to approach them, you can come up and you can hold their hand. You squeeze their hand and ask them to squeeze back. Use their name as much as possible. Try whatever you can do to make a direct connection with the person, not an emotional connection, not, oh, poor baby, that must have been so hard. It's okay. I'm here for you. You don't want to be there for them. You need them to take action, to take care of themselves. But the first step to doing that is being there with them, not for them, but with them. So make a connection, use their name, squeeze their hand, try and get them to squeeze back, try and get them to answer you. If you don't know their name, say your name and try and get them to tell you theirs, and then use it. Any sort of connection you can make where they're actually looking at you, where they're seeing you, where they're seeing that you're there with them, where they believe that you are not going to leave them, is going to help prevent the isolation from cutting them off from people. The next thing that you do is, once you have a connection with them, if possible, we have to make them see that they are not helpless, that they are capable of taking action, and that they can do something to help themselves or to help the people around them, that they understand they haven't completely lost control of the situation and of their life in general. So we do this by trying to get them, again, we're challenging them, we're trying to get them to think, we're trying to get them to use the thinking part of their brain and to do something to help the situation. So we might ask them to do things like count how many people were in the car, or tell us how many people were in the car, tell us where they were driving from, where they were driving to find their phone and call a family member, find their phone and call an ambulance if one isn't already there. Try and get them to do something that, not a random thing, like not sit down and braid their hair now, but to do something that will help the situation, that can prevent them sinking into that feeling of helplessness and the feeling that they don't have control over their life and that they are a helpless victim. Because one of the biggest problems that they're experiencing right now is this complete emotional overwhelm, which is preventing the rest of their brain from processing properly. We ask them questions that will require them to think. So questions about numbers, questions about time, questions about order. How long has this been going on? How long were you driving? Where did you come from and where were you going to? How many people were in the car? What's the phone number? As much as possible, questions that require the thinking brain, because our brain, it's kind of on a seesaw. The more we're thinking cognitively, the less we're trying to process emotions, and vice versa. The more we're processing emotions, the less cognition we have available for thinking these things through. If we can get the person thinking in numbers and in just doing cognitive tasks, thinking about things, being in the Spock brain, as much as we can do that, that's going to lower the amount of cognition that's available for dealing with the emotional overwhelm, which is what we need right now. Later on, they're going to need to process these emotions, but not now. Now we need them up, and we need them active, and we need them working to help themselves so that they don't end up in the long run feeling like they have no control over their lives, feeling cut off, feeling isolated, feeling helpless. And then the other thing which can contribute to, statistically they've seen this contributes long-term to developing symptoms of PTSD or other problems, is confusion about the events that happened. Because when the thinking brain is turned off, we're taking in information, it's getting processed differently, or it's not being processed the way it usually is, and people can end up with just random chunks of memory that they don't know how to fit together. They're not clear on what happened. They don't know exactly in what order things happened, or they can end up with kind of free-floating memories. It can become flashbacks. And statistically, we know that the more confusion a person has about the event, the order, the circumstances of the traumatic event, the more likely they are to develop long-term problems. And so one of the best things that you can do is to help them create a line of continuity. Okay, so first you left the house, then you got in the car, then you drove to school and dropped your brother off, and then you were going this way. Try and build the timeline and help them understand where everything fits in. For this reason, you do not want to move a person while they're catatonic, while they're not responsive, while they're in shock, while they're shaking. If they're not connected, if they're not seeing what's in front of them, and they're not connected to what's going on around them, and you put them in an ambulance and take them to the hospital, that is going to tremendously increase the likelihood that they will have this break in the timeline that they won't understand what happened because they lost connection with the world around them in one place, they came to in another place, and if they've lost that chunk of travel time, that can contribute long term to the confusion and the feeling of helplessness around the event. So obviously, if someone needs medical care, you take them to the hospital, you do what has to be done. But if possible, someone who is in emotional shock and is non-responsive should not be moved. And while you're trying to connect with them and show them that you're there with them and have them see that you're there, you don't want to get right up in their face and block their vision completely. You want them to be able to continue to see what's going on around them if they're capable of taking it in order to prevent an increase in that feeling of confusion. So this is the model. This is what you do. This is how you can help prevent long-term PTSD. Again, like I said, I have not just given you sufficient training necessarily to step in a case where someone is in shock after a car accident or something. But if you think about daily life and the shocks that we experience, and sometimes we feel cut off from our cognitive ability, sometimes we all get overwhelmed. These are all things that can help if you had a plan for the day and you had to suddenly, suddenly your car breaks down, you can't get to work on time, you have to rethink the plan, and you're getting into this sensation of emotional overwhelm. All of these steps can help. If you have someone there with you who can ask you cognitive questions, can remind you that you're not alone, can encourage you to take action, can walk you through the steps, this is something, or this is something that you can do for other people. And you can even, because taking action to help yourself is one of the best things that you can do to prevent long-term effects and to deal with acute trauma. If you know the system, you can prompt someone else on how to do it. And I did that once. My mother went to the hospital, and it was a very traumatic and scary day. And I ended up calling the phone to my aunt, and I was like, okay, this is what I need you to do now. I need you to ask me these questions, and I need you to help me put together these events. And I literally walked her through how to do the emotional first aid for me, so that I could get out of that place of emotional overwhelm. I know my sister, who has never done one of these seminars on how to learn this. She's only ever heard me talk about it a lot. Has successfully used these techniques to help a woman calm down from a panic attack. So these are good things to know. There are some really good videos about the subject in Hebrew, and this has already gotten very, very long, so I'm not going to try showing you a whole video and narrating it. There is one video with English subtitles. I will put a link to it in the notes. And like I said, I will put the relevant studies that have been done and translated into English, or that have been done by English speaking researchers. I will put those in the notes. I hope that this was sufficient information to be somewhat educational and maybe a little bit useful. If you have any more questions about this topic, or if anything was unclear, I would love to hear them. Like I said, this isn't exactly Chinese medicine, but it is absolutely helping people live better lives with less pain. And so I am all there for helping people learn more about this subject. So I hope this is never relevant for you, but if you need it, it's good to know. If you have any questions, let me know. And I will be back next week, I guess. I don't remember what date this video is going up, but I'll be back in a couple days. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Take care of yourself and have a great day. Bye.